It's a pleasure to welcome you to the Carter Journalism Institute here at NYU. I see a lot of people who I don't know, so I'll introduce myself and tell you really briefly what you're in for today. I'm Dan Fagan, and I'm a professor here, and I'm the director of the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting program, which is one of the graduate programs here at NYU. We've been around for 29 years. In fact, there are some prospective sharp 30s in the audience, so that's a big move for us to go to our third decade. One of the things we do is that we have evening sessions 4 times a semester typically, and they're organized by Lee Hotz, Robert Lee Hotz, who is a science reporter at the Wall Street Journal and a distinguished writer in residence here at the Carter Institute. And Lee finds amazing people for us, and he has really struck gold today with Siddhartha Mukherjee. We are absolutely thrilled to have Sid here with us. He has somehow managed to find time for us in between, doing top-level research and seeing patients full-time, and incidentally, writing one of the 10 best books of the year. He has somehow found time to see us, and we're very grateful for that. So I'll leave it to Lee to formally introduce Sid, but I'll just say directly how happy and grateful that you were willing to join us. With that, I will turn it over to Lee Hotz. Take it away, Professor Hotz.
Thank you, Professor Fagan. So, welcome to Inside Out. Our purpose here this evening, for those of you who have never had a chance to join us before, is to linger for a while on an example of the best in American science and medical writing, and with the consent and the connivance of the author of that work, dissect it, take it as a stellar example of craft from which we can all learn. I should say at the outset that this is a conversation, not a lecture, and that I both encourage and insist on your interruptions. What makes for the best kind of Inside Out is a digression that is prompted by someone who uses the microphone that Dan has got. So if you'd like to ask a question, just get his attention so that we can capture that for people who might want to watch this later on the web. We live in a golden age of science and medical writing. I think you'd have to go back to the 19th century to find a time when the literature, the laboratory of the clinic played such a big role in popular reading. And unlike our current professional writing culture, there is a rich tradition of practitioners and scientists themselves being the ones who write eloquently about new developments directly for the public. And one, Darwin, of course, is the prime example of this. But it used to be the main channel of communication from the laboratory to the public. And in recent years, we've really seen a revival of this, partly through the dynamics of the publishing business, partly through a renewed interest of the general public, and partly because a generation of unusually eloquent and energetic practitioners and scientists have come to the fore who themselves write brilliantly. We're very, very fortunate this evening that we have one of those people with us tonight, Siddhartha Mukherjee. Thank you for joining us. Officially an assistant professor of medicine at Columbia University, uptown, and he's also a staff cancer physician at the Columbia University Medical Center. He is also author of the book that we are here to discuss this evening, The Emperor of All Maladies, a Biography of Cancer. This is a book that has been named by the New York Times as one of the 10 best books of 2010. One of the top 10 nonfiction books by Time Magazine, and in that laying on of hands that all authors today seek and are blessed to receive, named by Oprah as one of her top 10 books of 2010. What we're going to do, normally we talk to a journalist, we talk to a person whose main practice is writing. But occasionally we do like to look at this, and we're informed by this from the view from the other side of the fence. In past seasons, we've been fortunate to have Nobel laureate Frank Wilczek, for instance, Nobel laureate Roald Hoffman come talk about their efforts to communicate directly about their particular research obsessions to the general public. What's unusual, I think, about this book and about you as a writer is that you are not putting out your theory of how this works. You're not giving us your version of the Higgs boson that you're chasing or whatever. You have actually kind of tackled the history and the character of a medical field, and that on the one hand is very ambitious, but it's so selfless, if I can put it in such a funny way. So let's explore for a minute your pedigree as a writer. Now, I know that you come to your current position through Stanford, where you were an undergraduate. There you wrote for the Stanford Daily. Yeah? You've written as a generalist for the New England Journal, for Nature, book reviews. But you know, when I was preparing for this, I couldn't help but notice that prior to this current book, the writing that you seem more in tune with was the classical, peer-reviewed medical literature. I just pulled this one at random, paper published earlier in your career. Murine cytotoxic T lymphocytes recognize an epitome in an EBNA1 fragment, but fail to lyse EBNA1 expressing mouse cells. This is not the kind of prose style that gets you up to the top 10 list. So I wonder if you could just start our conversation. Tell me a little bit about your pedigree as a writer. Your pedigree as a doctor, well documented. You know, Stanford, Harvard, Columbia, the New England Journal. How did you develop as a writer? I'm told you used to memorize great wads of poetry when you were young. Is that where it starts?
I think it starts with an interest in storytelling. I talk about that actually in this book very much so. It starts off with, I think if I have, as you're pointing out, I have no theory to expound. I have only one theory to expound about writing, which is good writing comes from good reading. And so I think of myself primarily as a reader, and I try to incorporate all of that into this book. I think one of the things that's interesting to me in the writing of this book in particular was that long before I knew the content of this book, I knew its mood. I knew its mood. Yeah, I had a sense of what, I mean, I was thinking about writing this book. It was obviously an ambitious project. I'd never done anything like this before. The content was so enormous. I mean, just this last year, there were 300,000 books published, 300,000 journal articles published on cancer. So you can see there's sort of like a fire hose of information coming at you. And your job, and my job in writing a book like this, was to try to get at hitting the main important pieces of that information. But long before all of that happened, I spent a lot of time thinking to myself, what should one feel like in inhabiting this book?
The reader.
The reader, yeah, what should the reader feel like? And I gravitated to a couple of books that were very important for that. And I learned from them. I sort of, really spent a lot of time. I read and reread those books, and I'll name them, we'll talk a little bit about them in more detail. I was particularly interested in Richard Rhodes' book.
I was very struck by that. You mentioned that in your acknowledgments.
Yes. Yeah.
Lots of medical books, and then suddenly this famously well-done history of the making of the atomic bomb.
Yes, so there were great, and I can talk more in detail about what exactly. So there was Richard Rhodes' book, which I thought was particularly interesting to me. Then there was, I'll mention 4 books, and they're very different, and that's, again, trying to capture the set of relationships here. The second book was Tony Judd's book, which had just come out. Tony was a friend, was a friend, called Post-War. And so that was the second one. The third one is the one that's perhaps most in the left field, but the one that I've probably returned to the most often, formally. And that is Primo Levi's book, Survival in Auschwitz, which I came back to.
Survival in Auschwitz.
Yeah, I came back to over and over again. I read his other works, and I came back to his other works as well, but I came back to Survival in Auschwitz over and over again. And then finally, a book that is writ large through this book, but in fact, a book that I don't borrow very much from formally, which is Susan Sontag's Illnesses Metaphor. So there were sort of 4 books, and if you can imagine, there's sort of 4 books in Midspace. I have a very peculiar personal manner of writing, which is I figured this out. When I was starting out this book, I thought I bought myself a very nice desk and a beautiful chair. And I set myself up by the window, and I said, this was in Cambridge. I was in Harvard then, and I set myself at the window, and I spent hour after hour writing absolutely nothing. And when I wrote something, it was complete junk. And so then I moved downstairs to the living room, and I set myself up there, and I wrote nothing again. And so finally, after 5 or 6 such attempts, I ended up in bed. And I wrote my entire book in bed. I would, literally, I would put all these books underneath so Richard wrote book, all these books would be stacked underneath the bed. I could reach into them and pull them out. And on mornings, like everyone else would go off to work, and I would be sort of like the person in pajamas writing in bed.
I have to ask, does your wife have feelings about turning the bed into like your work area here, your library? Would you just like stack books on your half?
On my half, and so most recently, I've been writing grants. We had a big paper out last year in Nature and so forth. So, and I realized to myself that if that what works, don't fix it. So I just recently moved my office to Columbia, and for the first time in my life, I was given the luxury of choosing things for my office. People choose desks and chairs and so forth. And so I moved the bed.
I was going to say, I can't believe that. You moved the bed.
Yeah, so I moved the bed in my office thinking to myself, since it's the only place I can get work done in, why fight? So if you ever were to come up, there's literally, I kid you not, there's literally, it's folded up for the most part. But it's...
This could send a bad signal.
So I moved the bed in my office, and I've been, productive that way. Anyway, so
you write in bed.
But to more serious, but to more serious points, when back to the point of Richard Roth's book, and back to the point of, so I had something of, I borrowed something from Richard about the way he enters this book, again, in a very selfless manner. He has the contemplative quality of someone observing an enormous moment in history. A moment in history that really defines the beginning of the atomic age for us. But yet his touch in that book is so sparing that it's unbelievable. It's almost like you can move to the entire book. That people who read it might realize that. But the opening page of that book is a real masterwork in just being the way it's crafted. It brings you to a moment in history where Leo Szilard is stepping off a curb in London. And that little thing that happens, Leo Szilard steps on a curb, of course becomes such a large metaphor, because it is in fact mankind that's stepping off a curb, right? But you don't realize that at the first moment in that book. This is before the atoms were split. And just taking you into this pre-atomic world, this naive, innocent world before atomic weapons, before we unleashed the power of the atom. And I was thinking about this more recently because of what's happening in Japan. So that was one thing.
A tone,
exactly. A tone, a kind of contemplative tone, a kind of deeply crafted, since he really wanted to find out every little piece. What was the intersection between whatever Bloomsbury Avenue and Shaftesbury Avenue? What is it like to be there? What is it like to visit there? That kind of tone to inhabit, to bring to that place. And then in contrast, and again, just in the stark contrast, and yet achieving the same effect. People who've read Primo Levi's book, again, that book is motivated by tone. And the tone that's very important to me in that book is Survival in Auschwitz is a cool book. And yet,
cool in a sense of being remote.
or
detached.
temperature.
Yeah.
Or perhaps detached, but in temperature. It's a very cool book. And yet it's precisely the temperature of the book that reminds us how deep, how the depth of what is happening here. I mean, this is really one of the quintessential tones of suffering in the camps, right? Now again, I don't want to make an idiotic analogy between my book and Survival in Auschwitz, but the more interesting thing to me was how does one, as a writer, achieve that place where you can convey information in a way that encourages a kind of dialogue almost with the reader, but does so in a sparing way, in a way that's not, that's interesting to me. I would often reread sentences from either Richard's or Primo's book, and I would wonder, if there are 3 words that are changed in that sentence, the entire tone of that sentence would change. The entire tone of the book would change. So how does one then create that tone? So this is a very long way of saying that I had first imagined the tone of my book, the mood of my book, long before I had imagined the content of the book. And that was when I first said.
Well, you clearly, at the outset, made a very interesting decision about this book, which is to cast what is in fact a history of the study and experience of cancer from prehistoric times, 2500 BC or so, to the present. Not as a history, not as a technical adventure story, but as a biography of a disease. What was your idea there?
Well, so, that is a complicated, as you can imagine, particularly for a scientist, that is a complicated step. And by that I mean the following. I mean, using the word biography in the context of disease always brings up the specter for a scientist of over-anthropomorphizing disease, illness. And yet, on the flip side, I kept saying to myself, when my patients encounter illness, particularly when they encounter cancer, it happens to be the illness that I'm familiar with, they do imagine themselves inhabiting, as Siddhartha very much put it, as becoming citizens of another country, visiting another kingdom. The opening quote of the book I'll read in a second. Their imagination is a very visceral imagination. It's not an imagination of history, it's an imagination of inhabitation. They inhabit a different place. They imagine illness in a very, very visceral, as I said, way. And so I said to myself, if that's the case, then why beat around the bush about it? Why not then call this book a biography? Because in general, of course, the original subtitle of the book was A History of Cancer. And it just didn't feel right to the project. It didn't feel appropriate to the project. In other words, historians generally don't tend to enter their own histories. But they generally don't tend to. The project seemed too visceral, and in the end, I kept thinking to myself, I'm drawing a portrait of something over time. I'm drawing a portrait of breast cancer in 1850, and the same portrait again in 1890, the same portrait again with changes in 1910, in 1950, in 2000, and that is a biography. This idea of repeatedly revisiting the same portrait, the idea, the imagination of breast cancer in this particular case. And so I said, finally, at the end, actually, the subtitle history had persisted right through the penultimate draft. And then I changed that in the end and said, well, to me, this project feels more like, as I said, biography. I think that change, that shift, was and continues to be criticized. Some people don't like that. Some people don't like the idea of recasting this as biography. And I think that leads to an interesting conversation usually. And so I sort of put it out there as a more provocative way of thinking of this.
Well, I thought it had a very interesting effect. I mean, cancer as a topic, as a condition, as a cultural metaphor. I mean, it's very high pitch. It's very charged. And there's a very high level of propagandizing that goes on,
Right.
which you delve into in some portions of your book when you're talking about the Laskers, for instance. I thought that by casting this biography had the effect of somehow taking that down a notch and allowing a certain distance that was informative. So introduce us to this character that you're writing a biography of. Introduce us to the personage of cancer.
Sure. Oh, it's a little bit like, and there's a quote here that I picked up from Lewis Carroll, which is, in the hunting of the snark, this team of people goes out to hunt the snark, one of Carroll's last somewhat mad poems, with all sorts of mathematical inferences inside the poem. But anyway, and in the end, the snark that everyone's going out to hunt basically vanishes into nothing. The hunt becomes a kind of futile hunt. And to some extent, I think some of them actually use that in the book. To some extent, it happens to cancer. In the 1940s, 1910s, we imagined that there is one monolithic entity called cancer, big C cancer, for which there would be one monolithic big C cure with one medicine, or one series of medicines, one family of medicines. And as we enter the actual history, that begins to fade away, begins to become infinitely more slippery. And that, to me, was very interesting as an idea. And what does one do in the face of that uncertainty? How do we respond, not only as patients, but as advocates, as doctors, as scientists, to something that begins to now diversify so enormously that it begins to become not just one disease, but many diseases. I mean, we now know that one breast cancer doesn't resemble a second breast cancer. So the fact that they happen to rise in the same anatomical organ belies an incredible degree of difference. And yet, of course, if you take the family of breast cancers, there are some deep resemblances between them compared to the family of prostate cancer. It's a little bit becomes like recognizing the human face, right? I mean, we know that there's certain fundamental features of anatomy that connect human faces. And obviously we know that faces often come in families, and yet the family of one face has no resemblance to the family of another face, and yet we can have a reasonable conversation about what a face is, right? So some of that begins to happen with cancer. And to me, what was interesting is, in the face of that, uncertainty, in the face of that adversity, what is the response? Some of the response is to grapple with simplicities, to grapple with, again, the big C cure. Some other responses are, to try to look for these underlying themes. So the answer to your question was, what is the character of this cancer, this thing, this entity cancer? It is infinitely slippery. It starts off as one thing, but by the end of the book we realize it's quite something different. Culturally it's different, metaphorically it's different, and most importantly biologically it's different.
How did this project originate for you? I mean, I'm very struck, for instance, to hear you say that the idea of casting as a biography came almost at the end of the project rather than as an initial organizing principle, because frankly it's a need. You're prolific, run a prolific lab. You have papers coming out all the time. I'm sure you've got postdocs nagging at you. You have patients, cancer patients who they claim their mortality, they claim 1 year time. Where did this come from?
Well, I mean, one major impetus was that I felt that while I was a fellow in training, I felt there was a big vacuum in this literature. I mean, there was a kind of, you can go onto a bookstore, you can look on Amazon, there are 5,000 books on cancer. But the kind of book they were was the kind of book that I was least interested in reading myself. Eat chiggers and it'll cure colon cancer or some nonsense like that. And so I felt as if this vacuum was, and sophisticated readers, I felt as if we sort of almost owed something to patients, because here they were asking extremely sophisticated questions. You could say that it's true for our culture. Here our culture is asking very sophisticated questions, journalistic questions about cancer. What is cancer? What happens next? Where are we now? What happens next? How do we get here? Is cancer increasing? Is it decreasing? Are we dying more of cancer? Are we dying less of cancer? Are there more carcinogens? Are there less carcinogens? These questions are deeply part of our public conversation, and yet I felt that there was very few attempts to sort of take a step back and say, well, what is the story? What is the larger story behind these sort of conversations that are happening in a kind of superstratum, as it were? What is this? What is the deeper structure? What is the history? And then patients actually began to ask me these questions. You know, someone during an interview on the treatment of breast cancer would say, well, how did we ever know that tamoxifen works? How did we get to this point? Or someone else would ask, you know, who discovered X, Y, or Z, right? And I felt as if all of this could be, there was a story behind all this, there was a connection with a series of links. And so I began to keep a journal, often recording these questions. I put circles around them and come back to them and so forth. And then by the end of my first year of fellowship, I ended up with almost 3 or 4 diaries worth of notes.
This is a conversation with yourself.
Right, kind of an internal conversation, exactly.
Not a diary in a...
No, not a diary in a day-to-day kind of traditional sense.
Okay.
And so then I began to sort of wonder if I had this, you know, 4 or 5 notepads worth of diaries. How does one put this together? What were the next series of steps that would convert this into a document that is really a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, or some end. And that's how the project grew.
Okay, well, you know, we're students of craft here, so on one hand, this is very interesting that you kept a kind of open-ended journal.
Yeah.
Did you then turn this into a proposal? Did you get an agent? How does it work from your side? You're not, you know, a Nobel laureate yet. You are not unlike us here, a writer starting out with a day job, trying to find somebody to get interested in what is not a beginning project. This is a fairly massive undertaking you're thinking about. How did you frame this as a business proposal, I mean, as a proposition? What did you do?
I'll give you 2 points about that. First of all, the first point is about writing as an expert versus a non-expert. It's very, very important to write this book for me as a non-expert. I could not have written this book as a Nobel laureate, just to use one example. But if I had a kind of inflated sense of seniority in writing this book, I think I would be physically unable to write this book. This book would not come out the way it did. There is something about, I hope there's something about not propounding a theory, not having an ego I have my own ego, I'm not saying that I'm egoless, but I'm saying not having a particular agenda to grind, which allows this kind of book to happen. Again, this goes back to the books that I was talking about. You know, Richard was not casting himself out to be the new historian of the atomic age. Right? He was writing a book very specifically about the making of the atomic bomb, which happens to tell us that happens to inaugurate.
Right, but just for the sake of discussion, Richard Rose is a historian.
I understand.
He's not a nuclear physicist.
Yes.
He's not a Richard Feynman. He's not a Robert Oppenheimer. He's not an I. Ravi. He's not in there.
Right.
Playing the game. He's an onlooker.
Yes.
Now you're doing both. You are in there as an oncologist, as a researcher, as a practicing physician.
But most importantly, I'm not Richard Feynman.
Well, there are times when I think Richard Feynman wasn't Richard Feynman.
Right. But most importantly, I'm not. As I said, the gaze, as it were, was not one of an expert. The gaze was one of discovery. I was more interested in discovering my history rather than narrating to you what my history was. And that process of discovery was important. I'll come back to some specific instances of that in a second. The second question is, how does one do this practically, mechanically? So it turned out that I was, even though I was producing stuff in bed, I was unable to write a proposal. Absolutely unable to write a proposal. Because every time I would write a proposal, I would try to say to someone who's going to read this proposal, this is how I intend to write this book. So it was like, imagine it was one step away from the actual writing of the book. It was telling someone this will be the content. And to me, that felt very empty, partly because I happen to have written articles about, in science, you don't ever tell someone, this is my future theory. about something or the other, right? If someone takes, if you read an article that says this is my future theory, that goes straight into the trash can. So you have to, it's a do and tell. It's not, it's not, you can't, you show and you do, and you don't expound about what you are able in future to be able to do, or possibly might exist in the future, which is essentially what the proposal is. So I struggled with it, and then someone gave me, actually my agent gave me some very good advice, and that was Sarah Chalfant, who works with Andrew Wiley, and who's an amazing reader. Both Andrew and Sarah are amazing readers. And Sarah said, you know what, so you're struggling so much, just write the book. Just start writing the book. And when you feel as if you are ready, that's your proposal. Append something at the end of it, but that's your proposal. So instead of spending hour upon hour upon hour writing a book about a book that I was going to write, I just started writing a book that I was actually going to write.
How long did you scratch around before you kind of got to this?
Weeks, I don't know, weeks and weeks. And then I started on page 1, and in fact what's interesting is, I'll talk a little bit about some changes. I started page 1, and I wrote about 300 odd pages and I didn't tell anyone about it. 300 odd pages of the real book, and then approached people, agents, publishers about it.
And in bed, writing the 300 pages. This is like with a laptop?
With a laptop.
With a pen in the...
So yeah, I use a laptop. We like to think that we invent new technology in the lab, but being in that position, I'm also incredibly technologically atavistic.
Atavistic.
Yeah, I can barely hack new pieces. There's this article that someone read recently about early adopters. So I'm the late adopter. I'm the person who comes last. So I had a laptop, which I adopted to eventually, but I still used pen and paper. I still like pen and paper, so I kept my recurring notes. I kept on pen and paper.
So you're writing this. You're in bed. You're on a laptop.
Yes.
You've freed yourself from the tyranny of proposal.
Yes.
No, which is huge.
Yes.
It's a huge barrier.
Such a relief.
But this is a very, very scholarly book. I mean, in a popular way. It's a history. It's excruciatingly detailed in its recreations of various moments and characters and personalities. And I'm wondering, like, where are all the note cards on the quilt? I mean, how are the file folders arranged on?
What I would do.
What do you do? How do you do that?
Physically, what I did is I kept all the notes in a diary, physically within a diary. So I would go to archives. There's a lot of archival work here. A lot of archival work was being done. Actually, New York. There's a lot of archival work in New York. And when I would go to the archives, I would physically take notes. I'd get photocopies, file the photocopies away, but then I'd keep a running diary. So in fact, there was, while this was in virtual space on the laptop, in real space what I had was what became about a 600 or 800 page running diary of notes.
This is your research notebook.
That's my research
This is your lab notebook,
yes,
right? There's a tradition here,
yes.
right? So you're used to kind of keeping this running.
That's right. And I would come back
stream of consciousness, thought process.
And it was more than stream of consciousness, for instance. There would be an article somewhere or the other, and I would have forgotten it otherwise. I would physically write that down. If I was more intelligent, I would have some system I would have to do this on the computer, but I can't. So I physically write it down. I would say, Papa Nikolau's stain, circa 1940. Look up, page this, picture this, that, or the other. Sometimes I would photocopy it, so I have a photocopied version of it. But the photocopy didn't make it. Really, I kept that master book, and so that's how that's the.
So this is more. I had to confess that at one point when I was reading this, I guess the second time I read it, I thought, because I hadn't appreciated where in your chronology this had kind of come, and you spent a long time on it.
Yeah.
And I saw that it was the product of something that began during your fellow term, and I thought, are these his class notes? Is this like, everything Siddhartha learned about cancer while he was doing his residency, and he just wrote it all down, and now he's rewritten it in a nice, elegant way, and that's how he did his reporting.
Yeah,
but you have a lot more going on here. I mean, you allude to it periodically. Oh, a trip to go find so and so. His name is the oncologist in South Africa who committed the great fraud.
Right,
thank you. Who you actually went looking for. So I was surprised by this. You insert yourself periodically, very discreetly into this text. Well, how long did you spend doing this faithfully?
I did the spade work right through. There was no point that I stopped doing the spade work. I mean, usually, and this is going to sound like a little bit of a truism, but as you know, readers are so smart that they will discover your discovery. They will figure out in a book when you are actually discovering something, and when you're not, when you're sort of pulling out something from rote knowledge. So for me, usually the answer was, almost always when I was stuck in the book, my answer was go discover it yourself. So for instance, when I was writing about mammography, which is I can assure you, on one hand, politically a very fiery topic, but again, in order to humanize that, in order to put a name to a face, in order to humanize mammography, how does one humanize mammography? I was finding it really hard going, writing about trial after trial of failed mammography. And my wife at that time was doing some work at Malmo. So I said, you know what, I'll go to Malmo. And of course, Malmo is where the final trial of mammography happened. Now, was it important to go to Malmo in the history of writing about mammography? No. But for me, to go to Malmo was very important. Just one other example. And actually, some of this stuff didn't even make it into the book. There's a section in the book where I was very interested in. I talk a lot about how crucial and how important, in terms of human knowledge, the structure of human knowledge, these trials that documented the link between cigarette smoking and lung cancer, right? The invention of the prospective trial is a very important moment in medical history. When you follow subjects, patients, men and women, forward as opposed to going backward, because our biases, we have very deep biases in recollection. So you follow patients forward. So that trial was invented really around solving the link between lung cancer and smoking. So in other words, if you could take a group of smokers and a group of non-smokers, and you could follow them forward in time, and you could watch the development of lung cancer in one group and not in another group, you could more convincingly prove that there was a link between one and the other. So it turned out, so I was writing about all of this, and again, I felt really kind of stuck and displaced in it. So I thought I would go to England, into the very house, physically, where this was discovered. And then I was walking from that house. I took a walk around that vicinity. It's in Bloomsbury. I took a walk around in Bloomsbury, out towards the London School of Tropical Health. If you look up, you're at the London School of Tropical Health, and you begin to figure out the connections. Now, these are just physical connections. On the balconies of the London people visited, there on the balconies of the London School of Tropical Health, there are these balconies are gilded. It's a very beautiful building. They're gilded, and there are these sort of great infectious diseases discoveries of the 19th century. You know, there's an Anopheles mosquito as part of the balcony, and then you walk around. The next balcony is a tsetse fly, and the next balcony is the carrier for Kala Azar. The next balcony is something like that. And if you think to yourself for a second, of course, what you've really experienced, what I really began to experience there, and I'm just physically now taking you for this walk. I kept wondering, here you are in the 19th century, and a disease is a simple vector. These things are called vectors. Anopheles mosquitoes are vector for malaria because it carries malaria. So here you are in the 19th century. These simple diseases, infectious diseases, they're not simple, it's a complete mistake. But these diseases have identifiable vectors, mosquito, malaria, etc. And then you come to the 20th century and things start getting so fuzzy. Is the cigarette a vector for lung cancer in the same sense that the mosquito is a vector for malaria? And this is the discussion that's happening really in the London School of Tropical Health in 1940. People are saying these chronic diseases like lung cancer will never have such simple solution. There is not going to be a mosquito for cigarette smoking. There's never going to be a tsetse fly for diabetes. There are too many factors. It's too much. It's too complicated. It's just way too complicated. And just to give you one more destination in this journey, and that doesn't find its way in the book. If you then walk a few more steps, you find yourself on Threadneedle Street, where the actuarial business is beginning. So this is a time when shipping is obviously of deep importance. And if a ship sinks, then you lose all your fortune. So you find a mechanism to insure yourself against that sinking of a ship. And so all these insurance agents are creating equations to look at risk. That's what they do. This is. So it doesn't take a big leap of genius or failure, to now figure out the connections. So you have to essentially borrow the equations from the actuarial industry because they are complex enough to capture real risk in the real world, in a complex world, in order to now begin to understand how to understand risk in the medical sense, right? So you really have gone through, if you were to take this walk physically in space, you would have gone through a very important circle in between 19th century and 20th century epidemiology, which is really an important circle in between 19th century and 20th century human anesthetic knowledge, right? Starting from the mosquitoes on the balcony to the remnants of the actuarial industry in Threadneedle Street, working yourself back to where Dole and Hill were working out the equations that finally solved the link between lung cancer and smoking. Now, is it absolutely important for you to take this journey, for me to take this journey to tell the story of cigarette smoking? Well, maybe not to, but to me it was important, because otherwise I felt as if, my own pulses began to lag, and I became uninterested in what I was writing. So I said, well, every time I had this kind of situation, I usually just went to travel to someplace. Whether it was a laboratory, sometimes it was an interview, sometimes it was finding some person. So it became a research project, much like writing, much like any laboratory discovery is a research project. So that's kind of a glimpse into the process.
How long did you study this?
For the whole book, you mean? So, page to page, end to end, it took about 5.5 years. But then there was the book like this usually requires about a 6 to 7 month reading period. So, in all seriousness, I sent it out to at least about 50, 60 people.
50 or 60 people?
Yes.
That you chose, not the publisher. This is
your
own peer review group.
Exactly. I identified my peer review group. It was very diverse. Statisticians, Harold Warmus was one of them, Bert Vogelstein, George Canellis, Henry Freyreich, just everyone in the field.
So you were very well read before you ever got published. How did this work? How did the feedback come to you? What did you want to say? What did this do for you?
Letters, emails. I would follow up with emails saying, and I had identified specific sections in the book so that they wouldn't. I said, do read the whole book if you can, but if you're unable to do it, I particularly like it. This took a lot of work. To George Canellis, I would say I'd particularly be interested in your thoughts about the history of the development of chemotherapy for Hodgkin's disease, and that happens in page 442 to 446, and then also in this blah 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 blah, and then this is what's wonderful about writing science. Scientists really take this kind of work very seriously and very generously. So George Canellis sent me, he doesn't use computers, so he sent me a fax saying, this name would be useful to put in this place. Do acknowledge the work of John Ziegler, who developed the first chemotherapy against Burkitt's lymphoma in Uganda. And so I went back, and meanwhile, my publisher was tearing her hair out because, time was passing, and I said, no, everyone has to read. And so then that was inserted in, or he would say, that piece about this drug is not really right as my memory serves. Do look up this, that, or the other. So a long reading period, 6 or 7 month reading period, in which there was a lot of sort of scholarly feedback that I got from people.
Well, this may be kind of opening up something that would be interesting for us to explore for a moment, which is, in science and medicine, there's a rich publishing tradition. There's a rich educational process to teach you to write. There's a rigorous, sometimes painful process by which communications about experimental work are hammered into shape and then published. And then there's what happens on the other side of the fence in the trade publishing world, in the world of journalism. I'm wondering, now that you've found if you can tell us a little bit about being edited in both worlds. What's the experience like for you writing as a scientist and being peer-reviewed and edited that way? And this process on the other side of the fence, where you're writing for a trade publisher who may or may not take the trouble to actually edit your work. And then it sounds like you created your own peer review system. Tell us a little bit more about this.
Well, so, a couple of thoughts about that. One is that one very important thing is that this peer review panel that I assembled for myself was very broad. Included people who had very purposely included people who had absolutely no history, were general readers who was reading I respected, sometimes was writing I respected, but who was reading I respected more than anything else. So I went to them and said, well, what parts of the book are interesting to you? Where do you get stuck? And I listened to them very acutely. And there are parts of the book that are motivated by that. I can point out one section, for instance. Someone said to me, I'd written this book, I said it was out in review, and one very good reader said to me, well, I just don't get Mary Lasker. Here she is. She is sitting in...
Tell us Mary Lasker.
Yeah, so Mary Lasker, a very interesting persona in the book, was born in 1900, became involved in really transforming the geography, the landscape of American health. She has a very important quote in the book which says that I'm as opposed to illness as one might be opposed to sin. So she had an evangelical quality in her desire to transform American health, and she, very unusually for her time, was a philanthropist. Very unusually for her time was a very prominent entrepreneur. Was very successful as a businesswoman. Married Albert Lasker, who people might know from the advertising world, really launches one of the great advertisers of America. He's part of the reason that we have the way the iconography of American and actually world advertising works is really borrowed from Albert Lasker, this idea of what he called salesmanship in print, advertising should convey information. So Mary and Albert get married, and then Mary chooses to take all her philanthropic energy and divert it towards American health, particularly cancer. Phenomenally successful. And so, but the questions that this woman kept asking me were, why? Why is this lady who, is a perfectly coiffed Upper East Side lady living in a perfect apartment on Beekman Place with white flowers and a collection of Monets, why on earth would she become so interested in having the nation cure cancer? And so for me, that meant going back to the archives and finding the answer. And it turns out that there are 3 seminal memories that Mary Lasker has, and they're actually in her archives. She talks about one memory in which she is a child and she has a febrile bacterial illness. And the only memory, it's actually very evocative, the only thing she's a child, and the only thing she remembers is someone saying to her mother's name was Sarah, saying, Sarah, you'll never raise this child. So that memory stuck with her. So that's one. The second memory that she talks about is a memory in which she goes with her mother to visit her laundress. Mary Lasker was obviously very wealthy, she had laundresses. And this laundress has had breast cancer, this is in the early 20th century, and has had a double mastectomy, a double radical mastectomy. Now, again, I don't write about this in the book, but think for a second, if you're a laundress, of all the professions, if you're a laundress and you have a mastectomy, a radical mastectomy, the most common problem with a radical mastectomy is that they would take up the deeper muscles of the chest. And to be and the 2 complications, one of them is that you were often not able to move your upper shoulders. And the second is that you often would get, not often, but occasionally you get lymphedema, very severe swelling because your lymph nodes have been removed. Now think about that as a profession. Of all the professions, I mean, there were many affected, trying to wash clothes. And so that's what I sort of spent time thinking, if you were Mary Lasker, and you wandered into your laundress's house and she had just had a double mastectomy, a radical double mastectomy, what would that feel like? What would that moment be like? And she writes about it in the book. And then finally, of course, and you can see that, sort of the bells of history clanging in the back. The third one is that she writes about an illness that she has in 1918. significantly, in which she is confined to her bed, so ill that she thinks she's going to die. And that, of course, is the flu moving through the United States, the flu pandemic moving through the United States. And so, again, to answer this woman's question, I had to go back in and add real detail to flesh out. And so this was what the peer review process was like. Someone would say, and so in contrast, Harold Varmus might come back to me and say, I missed some important character. He said, Mary Claire King is missing in this story. The woman who partly discovered BRCA1 and subsequently was involved with the discovery of BRCA2. And I said, you're right, Harold, I don't know why, but she is. But you needed a perspective like that. And so, yes, Mary Claire King had to be put back into this book because her role in history is important. So there were all these little pieces of information that was being bombarded by this peer review process that came back. And to me, at least that part of it, actually quite resembled writing a paper, a scientific paper. You get criticism, a lot of it. Your first response is to say, absolutely not, I don't want to listen. But part of the luxury of, I think part of being, a good writer and a good scientist is to really take a deep breath every time someone sends you some criticism and say, really, there's something in there, and get to try to suck it up and incorporate those ideas if you can. Sometimes it's physically impossible to do. But,
so I should add too, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the book trade, but do a lot of work for magazines. That kind of peer review or reader review or even source review that is unheard of in certain kinds of work. And book writing is actually quite welcome and often really incredibly helpful. It's a great part of the process to incorporate folks, including on a limited basis, even folks who are characters in your book and stuff. It's just incredibly useful. There may be exceptions if you have to be writing about something that's highly controversial or confidential, but generally speaking, it's an incredibly useful process.
Book authors often complain about not getting that quality of editing because the book editors increasingly are in a position where they're kind of forced to act as acquisition editors most of the time. But it does seem this funny thing, Dan, where the more ephemeral the product, the more heavily and strictly and carefully it's edited. I mean, newspapers, which last 24 hours if we're lucky, are intensely edited. I mean, every word is gone over. Magazines are very strongly edited. Books, often, the editing is done because the author read it again before he or she mailed it in. I mean, that's obviously not in a case like this or in many, but increasingly that's something that book authors often complain about.
Yeah, that's a really interesting irony of our business. That the more permanent the product, often the shoddier the editing. At least at times. So it's really important to sort of incorporate people who are on an informal basis that you may not get.
And the line edits to me were less interesting. Have always been less interesting in a book like this. The really deep insights. One of them I gave you, right? Getting into the mind of something and asking a question. So obviously, for a line edit, it's a query about internality, right? What is the interior space of this person? So that was much more interesting to me. And the other kind of edit that was interesting to me is that I talked a little bit about this before. There were 2 or 3 major chunks that were moved around in the book. And I can tell you what they are.
Yeah, no, help.
Yeah.
Because of chronology, because of thematic issues?
So actually, there are very separate issues. The first major chunk that was, I think you read the book, was the Carla story, the story that really carries us through the entire book.
And the Carla story is?
Carla is a patient of mine who has acute lymphoblastic leukemia and will become sort of our guide through the book in some respect. We come back to her over and over again. Now her story really began in the middle of the book. And so she was moved right up front in order to introduce the book. And I'll tell you why. It turned out that the reason, one thing, again, since I'm talking to, since it's really a conversation about not only about content but about style, one thing that I'm very aware of, and perhaps readers are as well, is that this book lives in its linings. It really lives in between, in the connection, because there's so much of physical and temporal space that's being covered, really 4,000 years with 200-odd characters that has been covered. Really, in order to tell the story in a reasonable narrative way, it really lives in the linings between individuals and between spaces. I'll give you a couple of examples.
Yeah, what do you mean by linings?
Yeah, there's a moment in the book when I'm telling Carla about her first remission. It's a very important moment in the history of any person's leukemia, the first remission. It's a very important goal. And Carla reaches that milestone. It happens, and I probably find the space, but anyway. So Carla reaches that first remission. And I tell her this news while I'm standing physically a few doors away from where Sidney Farber first discovered chemotherapy, right? And that is the moment, of course, when I introduce the fact that Sidney Farber's life ends in 1973. So that is it's a lining, because you go now from Sidney Farber's death in 1973 right back, you jump back or forward in this case to 2005, and really the only connection between them is the fact that I'm physically standing in the same space where this thing was discovered, this drug was discovered, and this drug, although its creator has died, in this case Sidney Farber has died, has allowed this woman to have her first remission, right? Now, it's a very complicated series of relationships, but they're all pivoted around the fact that I'm standing at that exact same site. I'm standing right there. And therefore, you as a reader believe me that I've actually created or allowed me to go and move as sort of like a wormhole through space and time. So that's one example. And there are many, many such examples. When you read the book, you realize, it turns out, for instance, someone turns out to be someone's uncle, right? Matthew Bailey's uncle was John Hunter. Again, they're physically separated in time and space, but that little connection between them allows us to move the story from one generation to the next generation in, to me, it seemed to be a more seamless manner. So that's what I meant about